Welcome to Crime Lapse. I am Eileen.
And I'm Charlie.
Before we begin, we want to thank Michael McDonnell for sharing his work with us. Thank you to Advic for their commitment to bettering the system, and we especially want to thank Helena and Gerry O'Connor for taking the time to speak with us at length to share their story and allow us to share it with you. They are beacons of strength and unity in the face of the most horrific circumstances. This is Murder for No Reason.
On Saturday, June 4th, 2011, members of the Gardai, the Irish police force, were called out to a residence in Castle Blaney, County Monaghan. The caller said that his friend had arrived at his house after stealing a car and told him that he had attacked the owner, who'd been asleep in the back seat of the car at the time. The caller was Oliver Mulligan. Oliver and his girlfriend had been asleep in their home when they were awoken by someone knocking on the window. Through the glass, Oliver recognised Conor McClelland. They'd known each other for years. Conor was panicked and shouting that he needed help after being in a bad accident, so Oliver let him come in. When asked what had happened, Conor McClelland brought his friends out to a car he had driven into the garden, and Oliver looked inside. There was a stone and some clothes on the back seat. Looking back at his friend, he saw that there were blood on his clothes and his face. They went back inside and sat down. McClelland put his hands on his head and started to speak about what happened. McClelland said that he had seen a car in Carrickmacross and took it. There was someone asleep in the back of the car, and when he woke up, McClelland hit him. He said he then drove towards Creevy Lake before stopping the car and hitting the man again with a rock. McClelland said that he panicked and feared he would get into more trouble, so he pulled the injured man from the car and drove up the road to turn the car around. When he drove back down the road, he saw the man was standing with his hands covering his face, and McClelland hit him with the car. The man hit the windscreen, and McClelland drove on to Oliver's house. He assured Oliver that it would be fine. He planned to bring the car to a scrapyard. Oliver Mulligan was worried. He told his girlfriend what had happened, and she told him to call the guards. Afraid to turn his friend in, Oliver rang another friend, who told him to wait until McClelland fell asleep before phoning the Gardai, and this is what he did. The Gardai didn't arrive until Oliver had rang numerous times. They were busy dealing with an accident a short distance away. When they finally drove into the garden, they saw a 2000 blue Toyota Corolla hatchback. They ran the licence plate, and the car came up as being registered to Gavin O'Connor. The front windscreen was cracked. Above the windscreen, on the driver's side, there was a significant dent. When the Gardai looked inside the car, he noticed 2 blood-stained rocks in the back. In the front passenger footwell, there was a pair of white runners and a blood-stained white jumper. Inside the house, 19-year-old Conor McClelland was asleep on the couch, still wearing the blood-soaked clothes. It took a few attempts to rouse him from sleep, and when he did wake up, he claimed to know nothing about the car in the garden. The Gardai brought him outside and asked him again about the car, and while the officers led McClelland towards the car, he ran. Avoiding the Gardai, he managed to make his way across a field before being apprehended by a female officer and arrested at 8:10 a.m. At approximately 5:30 a.m. that same morning, less than 20 kilometres away, 2 men returning home from a house party in Lisdoonan came across a severely injured man on the roadway. Jared Lynch and Dermot Boylan were on their way home when they noticed someone lying by a small driveway just outside Lisdoonan. Severe facial injuries meant that they couldn't initially recognise the victim, but they recognised his clothes, as they'd been out with him the night before. It was 22-year-old Gavin O'Connor. The men called for an ambulance before phoning Gavin's friend, John, who rushed to the roadside as Gavin was being treated before being transported by ambulance to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Drogheda, over 40 kilometres away. Gavin was in cardiac arrest when the ambulance arrived and had to be revived a number of times on the journey. The police had already been at the scene when the ambulance arrived and noted that Gavin's feet were pointing towards the road, while his head was towards the ditch. He had severe damage to his ribcage and head, he was unconscious, and his heart rate was dangerously low. It seemed like a hit and run due to the severity of Gavin's injuries. The paramedics that arrived had to try and help Gavin in the back of the ambulance while a Gardai drove to the hospital. John phoned Gavin's girlfriend Aoife to tell her what happened, and Aoife called Gavin's parents, Helena and Gerry. At around the same time, the Gardai received a call from Oliver Mulligan.
Well, what can I say? Gavin left here on the Friday night. At first he had said he wasn't going out because Aoife, his girlfriend, had forgot to book Saturday off. She worked in the nursing home. And he said he wasn't going out because Aoife forgot to book Saturday off. And then he was upstairs in his bedroom. And he came down and he said to me, I'm going to Carrickmacross. Justin is after ringing me and he said to come over for a bit of crack. And Gavin hadn't been drinking for a few weeks because he used to suffer nighttime seizures and he thought maybe if he didn't drink, he wouldn't have them. And I said to him, are you going to have a drink? And he said, I don't know, but if I do, it won't be much. And then he said, you know what? He said, there's a pack of Budweiser in the fridge in the kitchen. I'll bring it with me. So he came in here and he brought the pack of Budweiser. And as he was going out, I just got this terrible feeling he's not coming back. And I called him back and I said, Gal, do me a favour, so look after yourself. And he said, I will, Mum, I will. And that was it until 10 to 7 the next morning. Gavin's girlfriend rang me and she said that John McMahon, Gavin's friend, was after ringing her and told her that Gavin was gone to Drogheda in an ambulance in a very bad way. So myself and Gerry straight away headed for Drogheda, and we were halfway to Drogheda when Gerry's mobile rang. And I answered it, and it was Carrickmacross Guard Station to say Gavin had been involved in a hit and run accident. And I told them we were on our way to Drogheda. They want to know how did I know, and I said Gavin's friend had rang Aoife. Two of Gavin's friends were coming from a house party, and they found Gavin on the road and only recognised him by his clothes because they were after being with him earlier in the night, and they rang John McMahon, which would be Gavin's friend from the band, and John and his mother went to the roadside. So we got to Drogheda and Aoife was already there, and straight away we were brought into a family room, so we knew it's serious because the minute we arrived. So the doctor came in and he said that Gavin came in at 5:30 that morning, that they did a scan and that he wasn't going to make it. He said the only way we can explain it, he said, is Gavin's brain should have 3 or 4 compartments, but all it is a big red mush. He said the only reason his heart is still beating is because he's so young. He said, but eventually his heart is going to start to slow, and he said we won't be restarting it.
Gavin's Toyota was forensically examined. The interior was described as looking like a, quote, slaughterhouse, unquote. The keys to the 3-door car were missing. Inside, there was a significant amount of blood covering the back seats, and a pair of white shoes sat in the front passenger seat. The volume of blood suggested an act of extreme violence had taken place. This was substantiated by the discovery of 3 blood-soaked rocks on the floor of the car and 1 in the boot.
And John said to me in Drogheda, he said, I can't understand. He said Gavin had no shoes on him. He said he was in his stocking feet. And the liaison officer then came to me at one stage and he said to me, what kind of shoes was Gavin wearing? And I said he was wearing white runners. And he said to me, and he said, we have found the car. And I said, what do you mean you found the car? He said, there's something going on and I can't tell you what it is. He said, until we have further information. And I said to him, you can't just leave me here wondering what's happening.
The night before marked the start of the Carrickmacross Music Festival, an annual event that occurred every June bank holiday weekend. It had started in 2000 and in its 11th year had been anticipated to be a great weekend. Lots of local people had been out socialising that Friday night, listening to local bands and gearing up for the excitement of the next day. Conor McClelland was one of the last people walking the streets of Carrickmacross in the early hours of Saturday morning. While being interviewed in Carrickmacross Gardai station, he said that he wasn't able to get a taxi home. Walking along Farney Street at around 4:20 a.m, he came across a Toyota Corolla with someone sleeping in the back seat. He said that he was able to get into the car without disturbing the sleeping occupant, who turned out to be Gavin O'Connor. He proceeded to search Gavin's pockets and took out his phone and his car keys. McClelland drove down Convent Hill out of Carrickmacross. En route to his destination, he used Gavin's phone to call a friend and tell him he had stolen the car, and that if the guy in the back seat woke up, he would have to hit him. All the while he claimed Gavin was still asleep in the back. Somewhere along a minor roadway near Lisdoonan, McClelland claimed that Gavin woke up and asked him what he was doing. They didn't know each other. Conor McClelland said that he pulled the car over and went to a ditch where he got a rock the size of a fist. When he got back into the car, he hit Gavin in the head with it until he lost the rock. He went back to the ditch 3 more times for larger rocks, as each time they were so soaked in Gavin's blood that he struggled to maintain his grip. After the sustained, brutal attack, McClelland said he got out of the car to apparently clear his head. While standing on the side of the road, McClelland said that he saw Gavin get out of the car and stand in the road. It was dark, but McClelland could still see that Gavin's face was covered in blood. Conor McClelland said that he got back into Gavin's car and drove down the road before turning around and driving at speed, running Gavin over. He did this in order to make it look like a hit and run. After driving over Gavin, McClelland then proceeded to Castleblaney. This was where he was arrested hours later. A special sitting at Cavan District Court was held that morning, presided by Judge Kevin Kilrain. Conor McClelland was charged with assault causing serious harm, and his bail was denied. McClelland had attempted to escape Garda custody while in Carrickmacross Garda station. During questioning, he said he wanted to smoke a cigarette and tried to run. He didn't get far and was remanded in custody. Gavin hadn't planned on going out that Friday night. His girlfriend Aoife hadn't been able to book the next morning off work, and he hadn't been drinking in recent times. Gavin had suffered from seizures, having been diagnosed with epilepsy. He was worried the seizures were triggered by alcohol, so had been avoiding it, but the festival only happened once a year, and his friend had invited him out. Gavin was a talented guitarist and sound engineer. His band Climax were playing at the music festival the next day, so he had planned on getting up early to set up the equipment for them. Friday night was a good night. Everyone was in high spirits, excited about the gig the next day. Gavin had planned on staying in his friend Harry's house, but at the last minute he changed his mind. When the night was over, he told his friends he was alright and turned around the corner off of Main Street, back towards his car on Farney Street. That was at 3:21 a.m. The next time Gavin's loved ones saw him was in the emergency room in Drogheda Hospital. His parents sat at his bedside for over 12 hours as he was given blood transfusions. His injuries were so severe that they were told he wasn't going to survive before they even got to see him. The hospital staff said that they would treat Gavin until his heart began to slow. When it stopped, they said they wouldn't be restarting it.
So all Gavin's friends had arrived in Drogheda, and the nurses and staff were very, very good. They opened up the door and they left it popped open with a stool. And they said that it was up to me if I wanted to let his friends in to see him, I could, because Gavin was unrecognisable. His head was so badly swollen. His head was massive, and his face was all swollen and bruised. But you wouldn't know it was Gavin. So we spent all day in Drogheda waiting on his heart to slow. The staff made tea and sandwiches for us. We were 12 hours there, and Gavin heart was still beating, and we were sitting there, all his friends was there, and the nurse came over and she whispered into me ear and she said, Helena, Gavin's heart has started to slow. She said, do you want to clear the room to family only? And I said, no. I said, they all loved him as much as we did, so let everybody stay. So he was surrounded by about 67 people when he died.
Gavin O'Connor died at 6:43 p.m. on June 4th, 2011, surrounded by dozens of people who loved him.
Hours later, the liaison officer came over when we were in the crowd and he said, can I speak to you for a minute? And we moved away with him and he said, we got the guy that murdered your son. And that was the first I knew that Gavin had been murdered.
Gavin's body was moved to the Chapel of Rest where his parents kept vigil. As Gerry leaned over to give his son a kiss goodbye, a member of the Gardai told the heartbroken parents not to touch their son again, as he was now evidence. Helena and Gerry hadn't known their son was the victim of anything other than a road traffic accident. They were kept in the dark, a theme that would continue throughout the investigation.
Conor McClelland was interviewed 6 times while in Carrickmacross Garda Station by Garda detectives Bobby Ogle, John Callanan and John Doherty. When they informed McClelland that Gavin O'Connor had died, McClelland asked to step outside for some air. He then attempted to escape again. At the special sitting in Cavan Court, Detective Garda Ogle said, quote, he took flight, ran out of the back of the station across Main Road which was busy. He went down a laneway on the far side of the road which led down another laneway. All the time I was shouting at him to stop, unquote. Conor McClelland stopped because he knew he couldn't outrun Detective Ogle. McClelland said of the escape attempt, quote, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't even know where I was going. I just ran, unquote. Detective Ogle asked the court to deny bail as he feared that Conor McClelland would not turn up to any future hearings. Conor McClelland's parents tried to assure the judge that they would control their son and keep him under house arrest if he was granted bail. The judge replied, indicating that they should have done that before. A file had been sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions and a more serious charge was expected because Gavin had died as a result of Conor McClelland's vicious attack. Bail was refused by Judge Kilrain based on the flight risk posed by Conor McClelland, the seriousness of the charge brought against him, and the fact that another more serious charge was going to be brought against him. McClelland was remanded to custody before being brought to Carrickmacross District Court the following Wednesday.
He was on a curfew at the time, and the Gardai spoke to him on the street at 3 o'clock in the morning.
He warned them.
Half an hour before this happened, and he took him off the street. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was the only fellow left walking the street at Carrickmacross, and he had 22 convictions. And the liaison officer said to me in Drogheda that day, well, you know, it was only a matter of time before this was going to happen.
Before he did something.
And I says, and you left him out there till he murdered our son.
Conor McClelland was a recidivist offender with a string of previous convictions from driving offences to public order offences. McClelland was supposed to be under an imposed curfew when he killed Gavin O'Connor. It emerged that he had actually been stopped by a Garda less than an hour before he stole Gavin's car. The Garda cautioned McClelland for being out and told him to go home. If he had been taken into custody, or even driven home in a patrol car, he would not have had the opportunity to kill Gavin, whose life had barely begun.
While life had stopped for Gavin's friends and family, it continued as normal at the music festival Gavin was supposed to be playing at the next day. It was said that it was another successful year at Carrickmacross Music Festival, with no mention of the talented young musician who had senselessly been murdered there during it all. The Gardai and Carrickmacross were also carrying on as if nothing happened. As far as they were concerned, Conor McClelland was in custody, and the crime took place in Lisdoonan like McClelland claimed. Helena and Gerry were left with so many questions. It's hard to imagine the trauma of trying to remember when you last told someone you loved them, but it was a reality for Helena.
Because I remember after Gavin died, I remember thinking, when did I last tell him I loved him? And it's so funny, at that time we used to go away an odd weekend, and I used to say to Gerry, we'd be in the hotel room, and at 7:30 I'd say to Gerry, watch this, my mobile's going to ring, Coronation Street starts. And my mobile would ring and it hit me Gavin, and he'd be full of chat. I was at home, he'd have nothing to say to me. But and we were after being away for a weekend about 2 weeks before that, and at 7:30 Gavin rang me on my mobile, and he told me there was after been terrible rain and thunderstorms, and he said, I brought the cat and the dog up to my bedroom in case they'd be frightened. I said, to Gavin, the cat and the dog? He said, yeah. He said, I had the two of them in the bed with me. But we used to always finish off the phone calls. I'd always say, I love you, son. And he said, I love you too, ma'am. So I knew, I told him definitely I loved him.
Gavin O'Connor was the youngest child of Gerry and Helena O'Connor. He was born in January 1989, beloved by his older siblings, Patrick and Judith, who were 9 and 10 years his senior. Gavin's mother describes him as being the most beautiful little baby with long blonde hair. Gavin was adored by all who knew him. He was sure of himself from a very early age, a maverick from birth. Gavin stood out. His long hair and good looks drew attention wherever he went. One instance his mum Helena recalls was when they were sitting in a doctor's office and 2 women could be heard arguing over Gavin's gender. It's a boy, look at his clothes. No, it's a girl, look at her hair. 3-year-old Gavin didn't miss a beat correcting them. He told them, well, I'm a boy, because I have a willy. The room erupted into laughter, something Gavin was easily able to achieve throughout his life. He only ever had one haircut. In first class, his teacher told him that he wouldn't be able to take part in PE if he didn't tie his hair back. Gavin refused, taking a stand and sitting out the class for almost a month before deciding to cut his hair instead. Ever the nonconformist, Gavin's individual style continued throughout his teens. He was a nostalgic soul. He didn't feel the need for new material items, always preferring the worn look, something not many could pull off, but Gavin could. In school he put his own stamp on the uniform, subbing out stiff grey school slacks for some grey jeans and bending the rules that stated a tie had to be worn, but didn't specify how tightly. Gavin had the ability to make even the most authoritative figures listen to what he had to say. He wasn't ever disrespectful, he just didn't comply to senseless standards. He was often pulled out of the uniform line in school assembly. His mum remembers one time he was sent to buy school shoes after turning up in runners.
But he went to school one day, and I went to hear this, he went to school one day in white runners, and he wouldn't conform to me no matter what. No, I'm wearing them, that's it, ma'am. So he came home with steel toe boots. And I said to him, Gavin, where did you get the boots? He said to me, Mr. Gillick, he said, told me this morning, he pulled me out of the uniform line, and he said, he gave me €80, and he told me to go down to town and buy a pair of school shoes. He said, so I went down to the stalls and I got these boots for €20. And I have the €60 in me. Okay. He said, he told me I needed to get school shoes, and I told him you couldn't afford them. He said, so he gave me €60 out of the uniform fund. And I said to him, Gavin, you go in tomorrow and you give him back his money. He said, well, I will not. He said, he told me at the end of term to pay him back. He said, and I'll give him the boots at the end of term. His headmaster came to his wake and he said to me, Mrs. O'Connor, he said, did you ever wonder why the phone call stopped over the uniform? I said, well, I presume he's just got fed up ringing me. He said, no. He said, there was 4 teachers one morning. He said, I was one of them. He said, and the usual suspects were pulled out of the uniform line. And he said, and as you know, Gavin was always one of them. And he said, he has pulled out so many of them, Mr. Gillick had. He said, and Gavin put up his hand. And he said, can I ask you something, Mr. Gillick? And he said, what do you want, O'Connor? And he said, Gavin went, long hair, earrings, in proper uniform, how would that be interfering with my intelligence? And he said, I had to put my hand over my mouth to stop myself from laughing. He said, out of the four of us there, not one of us could give him an answer. He said, so Mr. Gillick never pulled him out of the line again.
Gavin had a tight-knit group of friends from play school all the way up until adulthood, some of whom formed a band with him. Gavin was a talented musician. He got his first guitar just before he turned 12. He spent hours with his parents in a music shop, trying different guitars and amps before settling on the perfect one. His sister Judith bought him his first book, and he began teaching himself chords. His first band, Buckfast, performed as a warm-up act at his parents' 25th wedding anniversary in 2001. It's safe to say the crowd weren't begging for an encore from the novice rock stars. But they perfected their craft, and when they played again at Gerry's 50th birthday party, they stole the show. Gavin was shy at first, hiding behind his hair, but by his 21st birthday, it was effortless for him to play even the most complicated of songs. Gavin was able to chat with the crowd, or walk off stage to whisper in his girlfriend's ear without missing a note. He radiated coolness, and his talents weren't limited to playing the guitar. Unbeknownst to anyone else, Gavin had recorded himself singing on his computer. Gavin had been putting himself through college while working in a factory called College Proteins. He was studying sound engineering. His seizures had meant that he had to leave his job, so when an opportunity came up for an audition with a tribute act band, he was ecstatic.
And he came in and he stood, and he always stood with his arms folded, and his eyes were lit up like lights, and he said to me, guess what, ma'am? He said, I have an audition with a Tin Lizzy band, tribute band on Monday. And he said, if I get this, he said, I'll be fine for money because they do so many gigs and they get €1,000 a gig. He said, I'll be great, it'll be brilliant. And they actually came to his wake, and they said it wasn't an audition, the part was his. He came highly recommended.
It's not clear why Gavin slept in his car that night. He had been drinking, so definitely wouldn't try to drive home. Maybe he wanted to make sure that he woke up early enough the next day to set up for the band, and felt that if he went back to a house with his friends, he wouldn't be able to get everything ready on time. So he got into his car, kicked off his shoes, left them on the passenger's seat, climbed into the back of the car and fell asleep. Gavin was safety conscious. Even at home, he made sure all the windows and doors were locked. He had been at music festivals with his girlfriend before, and he always ensured all the windows and doors were locked before they slept in his car. How could Conor McClelland enter the car, search Gavin's pockets, start the car, and drive over 10 kilometres without waking Gavin? McClelland had used Gavin's phone to make numerous calls on the journey. Surely that would have woken Gavin up, hearing a stranger's voice. If, like McClelland claims, Gavin awoke while they were travelling down a minor road in Lisdoonan, how was McClelland able to overpower the stocky 6-footer while maintaining control of the car? McClelland said that he took the rocks from a ditch, 4 large rocks, 1 the size of a fist and 3 as big as a shoe. How could he carry those rocks to the car without Gavin trying to escape? It would take time to find rocks that big on the side of a road in the middle of the night. McClelland claimed that he hit Gavin while he was awake in the back seat. He beat him with the fist-sized rock until it was so drenched in blood that it slipped from his hands, and he lost it. He then used the 3 larger rocks, one by one, until he lost them too. After doing this, McClelland claims that he stepped out of the car to, quote, calm down, unquote, and saw Gavin getting out of the car. Gavin had been in the back of a 3-door car. The beating had shattered his eye sockets. He would have had to locate the lever on the front seat, move it forward enough to climb out of the back of the car. The attack was so bad that blood had covered the inside of the car. Was it really possible that Gavin was still conscious enough to get out of the car after that and stand on the road? McClellan said that upon seeing Gavin standing in the road, he got back into the car and drove at him at speed, running him over. Gavin's hair and skin were found embedded in the windscreen and bodywork of the car. The major injury that caused his death was a hinge fracture. This type of injury is caused by compressive force on the skull that splits it in two. In this case, McClellan drove the car over Gavin's head. Gavin's injuries were consistent with vehicular impact. Conor McClellan wanted to make it look like a hit and run. It took Gavin's parents 3 attempts to enter the room when they were brought to see their son. The facial and head injuries he sustained made him unrecognisable. Conor McClellan didn't know Gavin O'Connor, but he completely brutalised him in an unprovoked, senseless act of violence. His charges were up to murder charges on September 22, 2011. Conor McClellan remained in custody from the day he was arrested until the trial, which was due to begin in 2013. It was postponed for a year, and in July 2013, McClellan's bail was again refused in the High Court. Evidence was presented that the accused had indicated that he would seek vengeance on the man who called the police on June 4, 2011. He was pleading not guilty to murder, but guilty to assault. The O'Connor family was supported by those around them, not least of all their son Patrick. After Gavin's death, Patrick became a pillar of strength and support for his parents. He accompanied his parents to court hearings and inquired about the status of the case on their behalf. Judith, the eldest O'Connor child, was living in Australia raising a family of her own. Helena had been battling fears that they were going to lose another child and expressed these fears to her bereavement counsellor. Her counsellor tried to reassure her that her fears were a normal part of the grief process. But unfortunately, her premonition was correct, just as it had been the night Gavin was killed.
On November 9th, 2013, Patrick left his parents' house to go to a nearby town, Navan. Before he left, Helena told him to look after himself because he was all they had left on Irish soil. Hours later, Gerry got a call to say Patrick had been in an accident and that he was being taken to Navan Hospital. Helena knew in her heart that they were going to bury their second son.
Patrick died in hospital from his injuries. He was just 33 years old. Gerry feared that time was moving backwards. They had lost their youngest son just 2 years earlier, and now their middle child was to be buried beside him. Patrick didn't have the commanding presence his younger brother had. He was a gentle soul who was equally as adored. He was empathetic and kind. Patrick was sensitive. He felt deeply and had his own struggles in the years before Gavin's murder. Patrick got his life on track and became his parents' rock. He got a good job and was in a steady relationship. He was planning on being by his parents' side as Conor McClellan was to be tried for Gavin's murder. Patrick loved to drive. It was his passion. Patrick loved trucks the way that Gavin loved music. Their personalities were different, but their passion was equally as intense. Unfortunately, Patrick wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Along the way there was a line of traffic coming in the opposite direction, and a car tried to pull out into a petrol station. This caused Patrick to swerve, and he lost control of the car. Gavin and Patrick are buried side by side.
Patrick, they always loved driving. From he was 6 years of age, he always said he was going to be a heavy goods mechanic and a truck driver, so when his truck broke, he could fix his own truck. And he thought he was driving from he was very young, because at the time my brother had a scrapyard. And Patrick used to spend all school holidays and weekends in with my brother, and they used to go stock car racing every Sunday. But Patrick was driving from he was about 11 or 12. And he actually passed his test first time at 17. He passed his rigid truck test at 18 and his Arctic truck at 19. But he absolutely loved driving. He said to me, he said, I'd drive a truck for nothing. If a man didn't want to pay me, I'd drive it for nothing.
On the day that he was killed, he was just going to Navan to do something in his car and driving up to Kilberry. He was meeting a line of traffic. And a fella in the car in the middle of the traffic pulled out to go into a petrol station and swear back. He called Patrick to swear, and Patrick lost control of the car. I know he didn't mean to do it, but the car behind him says he couldn't even see if there was anything coming. Poor Patrick, unfortunately, it was an accident, but what happened to Gavin O'Connor is just unbearable. You couldn't think that it's just wrong. Wrong. That somebody with no consideration for human life whatsoever thinks he can lay low now in a prison, be well fed, and be nice and be out in no time. It's wrong.
And it's not because it was Gavin. For what he did, he should never do that. He didn't even know Gavin.
Yeah, there's bad people in the world, but this fella is pure evil.
The trial began in February 2014. Mr. Justice Patrick McCarthy presided in Monaghan Central Criminal Court. Murder trials such as this were normally held in the criminal courts in Dublin, but on this occasion, for whatever reason, the trial was held at a special sitting in Monaghan. The prosecution were pursuing a murder charge. McClellan denied this charge and pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of assault causing harm. Mr. Anthony Salmon opened for the prosecution and told the jury that a person did not have to intend to kill to be guilty of murder. If they knew that they were causing serious injury that could result in death, then they could be, quote, presumed to have intended the natural and probable consequences, unquote. The counsel stated that the jury would be told that on the night of June 3, 2011, Carrickmacross was busy for the annual music festival. After a night of heavy drinking, the accused had found Gavin O'Connor sleeping in the back of his car and took his keys from his pocket before driving off. They would also hear how when Gavin woke up and told McClellan to stop the car, that he was beaten with rocks, the accused claimed to have taken from the roadside. In interviews with the Gardai, McClellan said that after he had taken Gavin's keys and driven the car towards Lisdoonan, he had turned left at the traffic lights on Farney Street, down the hill, then right and right again along the Molinari Road. He went across the Shercock Road and onto the Agalia Road before turning right towards Ballybay Road. He then turned left and finally right towards Creevy Lake. He said he didn't know where he was going, but he headed towards Lisdoonan. At this stage, Gavin woke up and, quote, started to annoy my head, unquote. McClellan said that he stopped the car and got out. He picked up a stone and hit Gavin numerous times in the head while he was still lying in the back seat. McClellan said that Gavin put up little resistance during the attack, and after he left the car to calm down. He noticed that Gavin had also left the car. It was at this point that McClellan said he got back into the car and drove off. His story changed in subsequent interviews where he said, quote, I drove straight at him and I hit him, unquote. He said that Gavin hit the windscreen and he turned the car around and drove to Oliver Mulligan's house near Castleblaney. He fell asleep after telling Mr. Mulligan what he had done and was then awoken by the Gardai. He absconded for the first time before being taken into custody. In further interviews, he said he hit Gavin with the car to make it look like it had been a hit-and-run accident. He insisted that Gavin got out of the car himself and that he didn't run him over while he was lying on the ground. A number of witnesses were called to testify about the events of the night in question. Friends of both Gavin O'Connor's and the accused, Conor McClelland. Friends of Conor McClelland stated that he had been highly intoxicated on the night and had vomited in the smoking area in the bar at one point. He refused to share a taxi with a friend at the end of the night, but gave no reason as to why. Gavin's friends said that they'd been out together, watching bands perform, and that it had been a great night. Gavin was in good form and was looking forward to performing the following day. He had planned to stay in his friend Harry's house that night, but instead told his friends he was alright and walked back towards his car instead. CCTV footage was presented as evidence. This showed Gavin heading back towards his car on Farney Street at 3:21 a.m. An hour later, Conor McClellan was seen walking from Cross Street towards Farney Street. Conor McClellan's account of what happened after he hit Gavin with the rocks is as follows, quote, "The man was lying down and then he was bleeding. I then got out of the car and went for a walk. When I came back, he was out of the car. I then jumped back into the car and drove off. I drove straight at him and hit him. The front window hit him. I don't know what part of him hit the window. I didn't stop after I hit him. I don't know what road I took, but I drove straight to Oliver Mulligan's house." Unquote. While in custody, McClelland had admitted to hitting Gavin with a stone, but didn't explain why there were 4 bloody stones in the car, instead saying, quote, "Maybe I threw one at him," unquote. Instead of showing remorse for assaulting Gavin and hitting him with the car, McClelland said, quote, "I wish I hadn't gone out." When he was asked why he hit Gavin with the car, he said it was to, quote, "cover up my own tracks," and that he wanted to make it look like someone else had hit him. McClelland didn't deny that he had asked Oliver Mulligan to assist him in getting rid of the car. That evening, after being in custody for around 10 hours, the Gardai informed McClelland that Gavin had died as a result of his injuries. Upon hearing the news, McClelland said that he felt sick and asked to go for a cigarette, and attempted to escape custody again. At each stage of the interviews, Conor McClelland was cautioned and declined to have a solicitor present. Dr. Mary Cassidy, the state pathologist, testified that Gavin's injuries were consistent with vehicular impact, which had caused extensive brain hemorrhaging and a hinge fracture across the base of his skull. He also suffered 2 fractured ribs on his right side, waterlogged lungs, drag marks down his right side, and bruises and lacerations to his head. When asked by Mr. Gillane for the defence if the injuries proved that Gavin had been standing when he was hit by the car, Dr. Cassidy said that Gavin's legs were injured in a way that indicated that he had indeed been upright at the time he was hit. She also found no injuries that would suggest he had been run over while lying down, or that the car had hit him twice. There were injuries around Gavin's face and right eye that were not consistent with being hit by the car. These lacerations and bruises were caused by something with a rough or irregular surface, likely the rocks found in the car. These injuries would not have been fatal. It was being hit by the car that killed Gavin O'Connor. The moment his skull was fractured, he felt no more pain. This was a small comfort to his parents, who met with the pathologist privately to hear her findings. A report was given by Dr. Sandra McGrath, a forensic scientist specialising in DNA evidence. This report concluded that the blood found on the 4 large rocks inside the car had come from Gavin O'Connor. Forensic collision expert Gardai George McColgan showed the court his findings, which included maps with the length of different marks on the road caused by Conor McClelland's driving. The various skid, brake, scuff and tyre tracks were consistent with the vehicle driving onto the grass verge and colliding with a person before continuing across the side road where Gavin's body had been found and back onto the main road. Gardai McColgan believed that the car would have been travelling at speeds of 22 to 26 miles per hour when it hit Gavin on the grass verge. At another lane on the left of the road, there were marks that indicated the car had turned very quickly, likely a handbrake turn. The hedge and fence were damaged. This was believed to have occurred when McClelland reversed the car to turn around. McClelland had said that he was driving in the direction of Lisdoonham when he struck Gavin with the car. He then did a handbrake turn and reversed into a fence before driving straight through a crossroads, across the N2, through Toome and on to Oliver Mulligan's house. Information obtained from the mobile network company Vodafone showed that Gavin's phone had been used to make 3 phone calls to numbers of people known to the accused at 4:44 a.m, 4:49 a.m, and 4:54 a.m. Gavin's phone had been found in McClelland's pocket upon his arrest. It had been snapped in 2. McClelland claimed he could not remember using the phone or calling a friend and saying, quote, "If the man wakes up, I'll have to hit him with a rock," unquote. He denied intentionally damaging the phone and the SIM card. The court also heard how the missing car keys were located in the back pocket of the passenger seat of the Garda patrol car McClellan was placed in after he was arrested at Oliver Mulligan's house. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Each day, Gavin's parents sat and watched their son's killer be greeted by his own parents. The jury, which consisted of 7 women and 5 men, deliberated for just under 2.5 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict to the charge of murder. Justice Patrick McCarthy imposed the mandatory life sentence and a concurrent 3-year sentence for the assault charge. This was backdated to the date of the murder, June 4, 2011, because McClelland had been remanded in custody from that date. The judge passed no remarks after sentencing, leaving the O'Connors to deliver their impact statement outside to very few reporters.
Gavin's water trial was held in Monaghan town. And there was nobody there, only one reporter from the Northern Standard newspaper. Not one person, only Helena did an article more for no reason to all the radio stations that it became public. Nobody knew anything about it or the horrific manner of it or anything.
Eventually I did up an email and I sent it to all the television shows and all the radio stations. I sent it to everybody I could think of. And that's when Prime Time came out and did the programme with us, and Joe Duffy got on to us and LMFM run to us. That's how it became public.
Only with that, nobody would know he was in prison or what happened.
The trial and Gavin's murder got very little media coverage. At the time, there were a series of trials occurring in the capital relating to bankers who had been involved in the provision of illegal loans. This received national attention, while the O'Connors were left in virtual silence. Frustrated at the response to her son's murder, Helena penned an email to major news outlets about Gavin and his brutal killing at the hands of a recidivist offender. A number of publications published stories following this, but the case still fell into obscurity, despite the level of violence and the fact that it could have been prevented. In Ireland, the punishment for murder is a mandatory life sentence. The sentencing judge cannot alter or increase the length of a sentence. They must simply impose it. A person may be convicted of murder when they intend to kill or cause serious injury to another. There are no distinctions a judge can draw when sentencing a convicted murderer. The average time served by criminals sentenced to life imprisonment in Ireland is 18 years. A convicted murderer has to serve just 7 years before they can apply for parole. At the time of writing this episode, the Parole Act 2019, which will ensure a minimum of 12 years must be served, has still not been implemented. The families of victims of homicide are rarely kept informed about the status of their loved one's killer. Their grief is often compounded by the labour of having to find answers themselves to questions that they should never have to ask. ADVIC, Advocates for Victims of Homicide, was founded in 2005 by families whose loved ones had been killed. The members have been directly affected by homicide, so they can understand and assist others. The non-profit charity want to ensure that the families of homicide victims are included throughout the criminal justice process and to introduce a system that treats the victims fairly. The charity assists those who have been affected by homicide through explaining the process of the criminal justice system and providing peer support. They also advocate for changes in legislation, such as the Parole Act. There needs to be transparency and clear communication at all stages of a trial between the prosecution and the family. There also needs to be improvements made to the family liaison service, including sensitivity training.
Unanswered questions, that's the way it'll always be now, because there's a closed case now. They've got the fellow that done it, and as they said to me, what more do you want? I wanted a lot. I wanted to know. I'll be asking myself, and so will Elaine, every night we'll be in here, we might have a drink, but then we'll be asking ourselves all these questions. 9 years later, won't stop.
9 years later, we still don't know what happened to it.
No. As to how we got into the car, where the rocks came from, everything. But we weren't told because, as far as we're concerned, the Gardai and Carrickmacross didn't want this over committed in Carrickmacross. So the only answers there is to whatever went on was what your man said, but the Gardai didn't particularly ask him any questions. So it was left up to me and Helena with our brains to try and figure out what happened. I walked around Carrickmacross looking to see where would he have got rocks. And I found a flower garden where there was rocks missing. And I brought it up to the liaison officer. And he says, "What are you looking for?" he says. "We got the fella that murdered your son. You want us to start the investigation all over again?" And I says, "Well, I'd like to know where he got the rocks." Well, he says, as far as they're concerned, he drove out the road with Gavin asleep in the back of the car. They're saying Gavin woke up. And they're saying then that your man stopped the car, got out of it, went over to the ditch, picked up a rock. There was 4 rocks found in the car. 1 the size of your fist and 3 the size of your shoe. So he did a shopping bag to carry them if he had them all at the one time. And if he stopped and was lucky enough to get one in the ditch and bet Gavin till he lost the rock, he went back and he got another one. And then he kept beating.
But what was Gavin doing when he was away getting the rocks?
He was unconscious, or semi-unconscious, didn't know what's going on. And he was going to go and get a 4th rock and continue beating Gavin till he had him knocked out. Then he drove out to the dune, and in my mind, he dragged Gavin out of the car and he drove off. You seen Gavin getting up in the mirror, which is instinct. That's what a human being is going to try and do, or anybody that's injured.
Well, Gavin was in on the grass verge when he was hit.
So he turned the car and he drove straight at Gavin with such force that Gavin's skull was split in half with the door frame of the car. Professor Mary Cassidy described it as a hinge fracture, and she says, that moment on, Gavin felt no pain. That's what we go to bed with every night. I get up every morning.
There's no way. He's saying Gavin got out of the car himself. There's no way Gavin got out of the back of that car himself because it was a 2-door car. So Gavin's eye sockets were burst from the beating with the rocks. So there's no way Gavin could have pushed the seat forward and got out of the car to stand on the road. But Conor McClellan's saying that he drove away, and when he looked in the mirror, Gavin was standing on the road, so he turned the car and he drove at speed and knocked Gavin down to make it look like a hit and run. I don't know. To this day, he's saying that Gavin got out of the car himself. I don't believe that for 1 minute because I don't see how he could have got out with the injuries he had. And Gavin was a big 6-footer and he would have been well stocky, well built, and there's no earthly way. I don't know how Conor McClellan got him out of the car, but there's no earthly way that Gavin got out of that car himself. He couldn't have with the injuries he had. It's the brutal, horrific way he murdered him. Like, he didn't just hit him with a rock and knock him out. Like, he absolutely...
Well, he kept battling and battling, and then thought he had him done, and then, as I said, when he finished him off the car, no consideration for human life whatsoever.
In late 2019, Gavin and Patrick's grave was vandalised. Someone had written insulting statements on the headstones and stolen or broken items that had been left there. It was a further devastating blow to their parents, who could not understand why someone would try and destroy the last thing they had left of their 2 boys. Visiting their son's grave every week is incredibly hard to bear, but they feared they would have to go every day just to make sure their sons weren't targeted again. One piece of graffiti read, "Unjust conviction." Helena and Gerry O'Connor have been dealt the cruelest of cards in terms of what circumstances they've had to go through, but they are resilient and kind. Going through losing 2 of their children within such a short space of time will lead you to expect them to be hardened and angry, but they're not. They have each other. After 44 years of marriage, there is more love between them than most people could ever wish for. They hold each other up in a rare kind of vulnerability, allowing themselves to feel the pain of loss, but never taking the other for granted. Helena has fought cancer twice, being diagnosed with breast cancer and lung cancer just 6 weeks apart. The current coronavirus pandemic has meant that they have to shield themselves even further, even cancelling their long-awaited trip to Australia to visit their daughter and grandchildren. The pain caused from losing both of their sons within 2 years has not lessened, but they are comfortable in their grief. They are wary of imposing their sadness onto others, but it's their pride that is contagious. Speaking with them, you get a tiny glimpse into what it was like to love their sons and be loved by them in return.
Oh yeah, they say life goes on long after the trail of living is gone. Little ditty by Jack and Diane, two American kids done the best they can.
It opens up a wound that unfortunately has never healed
And won't heal, you know.
and
but
won't heal.
all we can
No.
do is try to carry on. People say to me, how do you do it? And I have to say to them, we don't know how we do it.
We get out of bed.
We get out of bed every morning and we don't know. Like, there's not a day passes that the boys are spoke about or they're talked about or thought about, or I can't look. Their photographs are all around the house. If I stop and look at a photograph, I'll start crying, so I don't look at them.
Can't take them down and throw them out either. And as I had to say, whoever gets the house after us will just keep the picture frames. Nothing else will matter. Very lonely.
You know, it's, silly things. You say to yourself, like, like if they were here, would they be married? Would they have children? Like,
You tell them you love them every day, no matter what age they are.
all I know is we'd never be right again.
You know, we go to bed unhappy, and we get up unhappy, but we get through the day. We get through the day. And then
We do our best.
next year, next June, it's going to be 10 years.
No, I have to say the support has been tremendous. We certainly can't fault the support we've had. People have been very, very good, We appreciate it, and sometimes I think that's what brings us and helps us carry on. Gerry is my rock, and
Thank you, dear.
I love him with all of my heart. Probably will forever. Our life doesn't move on. Our life is, it's like I do say, we got the life sentence, not Conor McClelland. Because this is with us for life, and it'll come to the grave with us.
I want people to remember what Conor McClelland did.
Helena and Gerry don't know when their son's killer will be released, nor do they know if they will be informed about it. They deserve to feel secure in the knowledge that the man who murdered their son will serve a sentence long enough to give them some confidence that he has repented. They have never received an apology or explanation from Conor McClelland. Their wounds will never heal, but they should not have to go to bed at night wondering about the details that were never uncovered. The support for victims of homicide in Ireland has to improve drastically and immediately. The Parole Act must be implemented.
I would like Conor McClelland to sit in front of me and look me in the eyes and tell me what happened to my son. And I have always said from day one I would rather be Gavin's mother than his.